It was the early morning of April 26, 1986, when Sergei Ivanov, a young engineer working at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, was preparing for his shift. He had no idea that this day would be the one that would forever change the course of history. The day started like any other. Sergei, along with his colleagues, was tasked with running a safety test on Reactor No. 4. The test was meant to simulate a power outage and ensure that the reactor would continue to operate safely until backup generators kicked in. It seemed like routine work, but as the hours passed, the tension in the control room grew. The test was running behind schedule, and the engineers were under increasing pressure to complete it. The plant manager, Anatoly Dyatlov, was eager to finish the test, even though the reactor was operating at dangerously low power levels. As the test was being conducted, Sergei noticed something unusual. The reactor's readings were off, but the protocols in place dictated that they continue. His intuition told him that something wasn't right, but he kept his doubts to himself. After all, the test was nearly done, and the plant's leadership had insisted that it must proceed. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the floor seemed to shake beneath them. The lights flickered, and the room was filled with the sound of alarms blaring. Sergei's heart raced as he looked toward the large control panel. It was chaos. The reactor had exploded. In an instant, Sergei understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. Reactor No. 4 had burst open, releasing a cloud of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The explosion was felt miles away, and the reactor building was nothing more than a pile of twisted steel and concrete. The disaster had only just begun. The engineers scrambled to assess the situation. Sergei could hear his colleagues shouting to one another, their faces pale with fear. He knew that the explosion wasn't just a minor accident. It was a catastrophe that would have far-reaching consequences. Sergei ran to the control room's windows, looking out into the bleak morning sky. A plume of thick, black smoke rose from the reactor, and he could see the fire burning, consuming everything in its path. The radioactive particles had already begun to spread across the countryside, carried by the wind. Chernobyl was no longer just a power plant. It had become a ticking time bomb. In the hours that followed, Sergei and his colleagues were sent to the site of the explosion to assess the damage. They were told to wear protective gear, but they were not told the full extent of the danger. They were unaware that the radiation levels were already deadly. Sergei, like many others, carried on with the work, trying to contain the damage, not fully understanding the silent threat that had already begun to infiltrate their bodies. As he walked through the ruined reactor building, Sergei felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The ground beneath his feet was hot, and the air tasted of something metallic, something that made his stomach churn. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but the reality of the situation was too overwhelming. His mind raced with the consequences of what had just happened. Soon, the evacuation orders began to come in. Pripyat, the town located just a few kilometers from the plant, was evacuated, and a 30-kilometer exclusion zone was established around the plant. But for many, it was already too late. Sergei didn't know it then, but the radioactive cloud had already reached nearby cities, poisoning thousands of people. Days passed, and Sergei was sent to Moscow to brief the authorities on the explosion. It was only there that he began to understand the true scale of the disaster. The Soviet government had tried to keep the explosion under wraps, but the international community soon learned of the Chernobyl disaster, and the world watched in shock as the extent of the radiation damage was revealed. Sergei would live, but many of his colleagues would not. The radiation had taken its toll on their bodies. Sergei, too, would feel its effects in the years to come. But what haunted him most were the faces of the people he had failed to warn. The workers, the soldiers, the civilians. People who had no idea what they were walking into. In the years that followed, Sergei would carry the weight of that day with him. The disaster at Chernobyl became a symbol of both human error and government secrecy. It was a silent warning, one that could never be undone. The town of Pripyat would remain abandoned, a ghost town, and the Chernobyl exclusion zone would stand as a stark reminder of the dangers of nuclear power and the cost of negligence. This story, though fictionalized, reflects the fears, confusion, and devastation that followed the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. the personal impact and tragic cons.